Hi everybody. So this is going into a little bit further detail about APA style in anticipation of your writing your book report and your final paper later this semester. The book report is due this week and your final paper is due a little bit later, of course, but this is going through some general rules on APA style that I'm going to be paying a little bit more attention to than I did for your proposal. So when it comes to overall general formatting, I tend to look for some standards. Things should be double spaced. You should use Times New Roman font, 12 point. And I need all your sources cited, of course, in APA style, which we're going to be going through a little bit more in just a little bit. One of the things I did want to point out is that I don't want you to engage in what's known as secondary citations. Secondary citations are when you summarize a source that you found in another source. So for example, if you were reading an article by Smith and Jones, and Smith and Jones mention Lewis and Kim, and you cited Lewis and Kim in your paper, that would be a secondary citation. I want you to cite the sources that you have rather than the sources that they mention. Unless you track down Lewis and Kim and provide that as a full source that you found and read, I don't want you citing sources that other people summarize. I want you citing original sources. When you provide APA style references, it should be on a separate page in order by first author. And once again, the document, the video that I made about how to do a search goes through how to find the information for APA style references. I'm going to provide information on how to cite an APA style document about how to cite non-traditional sources like books and films, because they involve a slightly different style than journal articles. So you can look to those, to that document as well as to Purdue OWL for how to cite books and film for your book report. Here's some basics about citation, and I'm going to include some examples in the quiz later so you can test your knowledge. So first of all, the standard rule of thumb when we're engaging in APA style citation is to not provide any first names or first initials. And a full citation includes the last names of the authors involved and the year the study was published. If all you do in your paper is provide the last names of the authors and the year the study was published, that's a really great start. There's some additional formatting that I want to go through, but as a starting place, that's a good place to be. There's two different forms of citations. One is in text and the other is parenthetical. Let's go through in-text citations first. So with in-text citations, what you do is you mention the author's names as part of the sentence, and then you provide the year immediately following in parentheses. So you might say, Lewis and Kim, 2010, in parentheses, had this to say about this particular phenomenon. If the author's names are an organic part of the sentence, then you just provide the year immediately following, and that fulfills the nature of APA citations. It includes the author's names and year. You're good to go. A parenthetical citation would be where you put the author's names and year in parentheses at the end of the sentence if you don't otherwise mention the author's name. So for example, Smith and Kim, 2009 in parentheses following a sentence. Now, I didn't put a full sentence in front of it, but you get the general idea. One general rule of thumb when you're dealing with parentheses, like you would in the in-text citation with 2009 in parentheses, or in the parenthetical citation with the author's names and year in parentheses, is that you want the part of the sentence in parentheses to be removable and to have the rest of the sentence make grammatical sense. So for example, you wouldn't say, according to parentheses, Smith, comma, 2010, end parentheses, this is the definition of envy. Because if you were to take that part in parentheses out of the sentence, it would read, according to, this is the definition of envy, right? You want to make sure that you are grammatically appropriate when you remove the part that's in parentheses. All right, so here's how you deal with authors. If you have one author, you mention that author's last name and year, and you've got a full citation. If you have multiple authors, we have different rules about how to handle them. So here's how we go. If there's two authors, you cite both of the author's last names each and every time, and the year. Oh, you might notice up above, I say Smith and Kim in in-text citation where I spell out A and D, whereas when they're in parentheses in the parenthetical citation, I use an ampersand. We use the ampersand as a shorter version of the citation, and we would only use that when they're in parentheses. All right, if there are 3 to 5 authors, here's how we tend to handle it. You mention every single one of the authors the first time around, and then subsequent times, you mention the first author's last name followed by et al., which is Latin for and others. The period is actually important. You would make sure to include that part. So you might cite for the first time Smith, Jacobson, and Peters, 2010. And then if you cite that study again, you would provide the following citation, Smith et al., 2010. You can see how that is how that particular citation would look. Also, once again, if we're tracking, the first one would be an in-text citation, the second one is parenthetical. It doesn't matter which type of citation it is, it just matters that you're citing all the authors the first time around, and the second time around you're using a shorter version. And if there's more than 5 authors, we go with a shorter version of the citation right from the start. The one way of thinking about it is that if you had a study that had 20 authors, it would take up an awful lot of space to list each one of those people's last names. So when there's more than 5, we go with a shortened version of the citation right from the beginning. So that's the basics when it comes to APA style citation and authors within the body of your paper. I would also recommend that you look to online sources such as Purdue OWL, which I've linked, as well as the How to Cite an APA Style document, which works you through many different examples. All right, let's talk just a little bit about when you should quote. So I'm going to go ahead and say this. When you're writing your book report, quotations from the text or film are perfectly appropriate to illustrate the point you're trying to make. Usually in scientific writing, we don't quote. However, in this particular case, the original words from the text and film might be powerful illustrations of what you're trying to demonstrate as you apply it to theory. So, to distinguish, I expect you to quote from the text or film, but I don't expect you to quote when you're summarizing social psychology theory. Quotes should be no more than 10% of your book report paper, and there's 2 different styles of formatting. We use one style of formatting for quotes that are 40 words or less, and one style of formatting for more than 40 words. So for 40 words or less, you provide a full citation that includes quotation marks around the quote and the page number or numbers or timestamp. So you can see how when it's page number, it would be just a P followed by a period, and if it's page numbers, it would be PP. So here's an example of a quote expressed as a parenthetical citation as well as an in-text citation. So you might notice the quotation marks around the quote, the author's name, year, and page number are all provided. It's just whether it's in a certain order or not. You might also notice for the in-text citation, the quote has a little parentheses around the T that indicates that you've changed the capitalization of it for the purposes of having it fit into the sentence. You can also make use of ellipses to indicate when you're starting partway through a sentence. When there are quotes that are more than 40 words, you use a block quote. With a block quote, there are no quotation marks. The entire quote is tabbed, and at the end you provide a parenthetical citation following the end punctuation. So whereas end punctuation goes after the citation for quotes that are 40 words or less, it goes after the quote for block quotes. So let me go ahead and show you an example of what a block quote might look like. So you'll notice here there's a section that's tabbed over. There's a bunch of nonsense words, but the important thing is to show the formatting, right? So you can see how it provides the author's name and year right before the quote, and then after it, it provides the page number. So it's a full citation that includes all the different pieces that you need, and the page number is provided after the end punctuation at the end of that block that's tabbed over. It's important to understand that when you're summarizing research or theories, you shouldn't quote. So whereas it's perfectly appropriate to provide quotes from the book or from the film that you're summarizing, when you're talking about theories or when you're summarizing other people's research, I don't expect you to quote. So in the book report, you shouldn't quote social psychological theory, and in your paper, you also shouldn't be quoting when you're summarizing other people's research. Scientific writing focuses on ideas, not words. So you're going to be summarizing or paraphrasing in your own words. And we're going to get to what summarizing and paraphrasing look like in just a little bit. Keep in mind that for your book report, I'm going to expect you to cite your book or film in APA style. I'm not going to be as picky about you citing theories and providing a proper APA style citation and reference for them. But I do expect you to mention the theories by name. So I'm just going to go ahead and say I'm not going to be as picky about you citing the origin of a given theory, as long as you properly define it and name it. I'm going to assume that the source is class lecture. So for example, if you were talking about the outgroup homogeneity effect, you would call it by its proper name, but I wouldn't require that you provide a citation of that particular phenomenon or theory in your paper. And coming back to it, when you are summarizing research in order to support your follow-up study or your intervention, you should be citing your sources in your project paper using APA style and summarizing the results of those studies using your own words. So in general, you provide a citation when you're summarizing another author's ideas, results, materials, or words. We've already talked about when we use quotes, and the fact that when we do use quotes, we have quotation marks around them. But even when you're just summarizing someone else's results from a study, you would provide a citation. We also use citation to help the reader distinguish what source we're talking about at any given time, or whether something is your idea or the author's idea that you're citing. So generally, a good rule of thumb is if the entire paragraph is about a single source and every single sentence is about that source, and there's no side commentary or thoughts from you, it's just a pure summary, then you just have to provide a single citation at the beginning of the paragraph and you'd be covered. If, however, you switch back and forth during the middle of the paragraph, for example, you start off talking about source A and then talk about source B and then might talk about source A again, you have to cite each time so the reader can track what source you're talking about at any given time. Likewise, when you're switching off between talking about a source and talking about your interpretation of the source, you would cite every time it comes directly from the source in order to track what is original and what is from another source. You cite it so the reader can track at any given time where the information is coming from. So here's an example where I have information from a source and then I delve into my own personal thoughts. The information from the source is in red and it says, envy often involves a sense of inferiority, Leach and Spears, 2008. And then I switch to green. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that, and then I would continue with my own personal thought. So you can see how when I'm describing something taken from another source, I cite, and then I switch into my own thoughts, and the part that is uncited can be assumed to be the author's original ideas. I would say you can always dial it back. You can always oversight and then take away some citations if you need to. When in doubt, cite, and you can always cite less in future once you learn a little bit more about when it's appropriate. Let's talk just a little bit more about paraphrasing versus summarizing. So keep in mind that when you are summarizing another person's source, you're not just rearranging the words on the page and calling it done. A good paraphrase is putting someone else's idea in your own words and using your own language. So the definition of paraphrasing is where you're rephrasing someone else's ideas using your own words. You're going to put all of the important points in the same order as the original idea and include all of those points. And your paraphrase should be of a similar length to the original phrase that you're summarizing. You only use paraphrasing when it's important to maintain all of the arguments that the original source had. So if your original source said there are 4 potential causes to this phenomenon, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you want to summarize it, then you would provide all 4 of those potential causes in your paraphrase. Keep in mind, once again, that the paraphrase is not just replacing a few words here and there and then saying, okay, I've done an adequate job. You're basically translating that original source into your own language in order to explain it to other people using your own words. Just simply copying and pasting the sentence and replacing 1 or 2 words is not sufficient. When you're summarizing, it's a little bit different than paraphrasing. Summarizing is condensing an idea as opposed to replicating each and every one of the points in it. It tends to be much shorter, and you would pick and choose which parts were important to your paper. So for example, if the original source said there are 4 causes, 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you were really only interested in the first cause, you would only focus on that part of it if you were summarizing as opposed to paraphrasing. And I will also say, it is far easier to avoid plagiarism when you're summarizing a source as opposed to paraphrasing. So a condensed version where you're taking the article's results and presenting it in 2 sentences makes it a lot harder to copy and paste by mistake and unintentionally plagiarize. Here's some general things to think about when you are writing and trying to cite appropriately. So the first is to think out loud. One of the things I'm asking you to do is to summarize a source using your own words. And talking about a source with someone else is actually a really great way to make sure that you're using your own language. When we talk out loud, we use a slightly different part of our brain than when we write. And you're far more likely to summarize using your own words when you're talking than when you're writing. You tend not to get buried up, down in jargon. It tends to be less stiff and wordy. And so I would recommend talking about the results of the study with someone else. Even just saying, hey, I read a really interesting study for class and this is what it was about, can be a way to break down those concepts and use a slightly different part of your brain while doing so to trick yourself into using your own words. I cannot recommend this enough. Put the original source aside while you're working on your writing. It is a very human mistake to make to unintentionally copy someone else's language while you're writing if it's right in front of you. If you have the original source aside and instead try to recreate what you think the source is about from memory, then you're a lot more likely to use your own language and to make it more simple and straightforward. So I would recommend putting the original source aside while you're working on your writing so that you don't unintentionally copy their language. This is another point I'm very passionate about. It is so important to use simple and easy to understand language when you're writing. It is very possible to express complex and layered issues and topics with simple language. And writing that uses simple and easy to understand language accomplishes a few things. It's approachable so that readers from a variety of backgrounds can understand it, and it's very clear that you understand the concepts and are able to break them down into simple concepts and ideas that are easily expressed. Not all scientific writers can do this. Some scientific writers are very bad at using simple, easy to understand language. I want you to be better than them, and I want you to practice the art of summarizing someone else's ideas using your own words. And I can understand that you understand an article better when you do this, instead of just parroting someone else's words. So really try to make an effort to summarize this using straightforward language. Scientific writing is lean, mean, and to the point. Don't depend on other people's jargon or feel the need to be expansive. I want your paper to be short and sweet and to accomplish what it needs to do. You don't have to go on and on and on about your sources. You can summarize the study's results in 2 sentences and accomplish what you need to. Sometimes it helps to write an outline of the points you wish to make as you're going through this translation between reading a source and summarizing it using your own words. If you do make an outline of the points you wish to make, I would strongly recommend tracking whenever you use the source's direct words by putting quotation marks around it so that you don't unintentionally have that leak over into your paper and then assume that it's an original thought that you had. So track quotes whenever possible in the drafting process. And once again, I don't expect your final paper to have any quotes in it. I really do want you to use your own words and to summarize as best as you can in your own words instead of adapting the language of someone else. I will be putting your papers through Turnitin.com, and I consider this to be an educational opportunity and exercise. If too much of your language is too similar to the original studies that you're summarizing, I'm going to ask you to write it again so that it can be more in your own words. So this is going to be an exercise in learning how to summarize in your own words appropriately, as well as how to cite appropriately in APA style.